This is update for August 11, 2023, day 534 of the war, end of the date update. Also catch up for August 10. I'm going to start as always from general strategic update, and then I'm going to switch to the situation on the front line in Ukraine. As you can see, I'm going to start with the situation in the US banking system. Just want to quickly sort of say the same what I've been saying before. The situation is essentially there is a problem, but it's frozen, and there is basically in the remission. So as you can see, rates more or less the same, slowly declining borrowing by the banking system. So and then also if you look here at the loss of deposits, looks like there's even uptick. So which is surprising actually, because the banks in the US still don't offer competitive rates. So it's interesting if anyone would be willing to sort of bring their money to the banks. But nevertheless, this is the numbers, and that's what it is. Now I want to go a little bit about the economic statistics from the US and some other countries. So first, I want to highlight situation with export and import in US. So as you can see, US is not immune, and the exports are declining, imports are declining. However, as you can see, export is declining faster than import. And so what this really means, if you really think, is when and US is always importing, or not always, but it has negative trade balance, which means it's importing more than it's exporting to the world. And so, in other words, what it does, it's exporting US dollars to the world for the difference when imports exceed exports. And that creates liquidity in the world and availability of US dollars, basically to function as a world global currency. And so when you have imports declining, and you can see they're declining faster than exports, what this really means is the amount of US dollar mass that's being pushed into the world is actually declining and actually shrinking. So it's effectively decrease in liquidity, in the US dollar liquidity in the world. And so that will create a stress on many borrowers around the world who are, sort of weaker links in the world economic system. And now actually want to have a look at situation with China, and it looks really, I would say, bad. As you can see, imports from China really declined by like 29% in June, year on year, and exports declined by 11%. So as you can see, US is cutting off its economic ties with China effectively. I'm not saying that this is official statement, but if you look at the factual numbers, that's really what is happening. And obviously, imports, US was importing from China for the most part. There is not much of sort of US exports going to China in the first place. So as you can see, that the decline is really staggering, and this is extremely important in terms of that this is not just rhetoric, aggressive rhetoric from both sides, but this is a clear sign, or sort of signpost that's being passed on the path to the military conflict. Because first you cut your economic ties before you have military conflict, and both countries are very clearly on the collision course, just looking at the economic data. Then, if we look at the inflation data in US, as you can see, it's barely going down. Essentially, it stays more or less the same. Similar situation in PPI. It's actually the same. And then there is sort of even more. So there are first real signs of weakness in the labor market in the US. As you can see, the initial jobless claims spiked to 148,000. If you remember, if we looked before, they were just kind of like in 220 range. Now this is really a clear spike outside of the range. If we look even further in the past, there was high of 237. So this looks like clearly, move to the upside, which is obviously negative. And this is the sort of weakness in the labor market will probably start developing and will continue as long as rates stay where they are. Which, looking at inflation, U.S. Central Bank or Federal Reserve will be forced to keep interest rates where they are. I'm not sure if they're gonna increase them, but it's very clear there is no compelling reason, or I would say there is a compelling reason not to decrease them. Let's put it this way. Let's look at other countries. So also unemployment is start to go up in South Korea. We are at the very early stages of the weakness in the labor market. I would say probably around the world. They just, as you saw, the U.S. Is going sort of in a negative direction than South Korea, and I'm sure there will be more in the coming weeks and months. More countries showing the same result. Then, if we look at Japan, situation with machine tool orders remains more or less the same. The only sort of, I would say, relatively positive that acceleration to the downside has stopped. So at least looks like the problem is sort of contained at the low level. And the reason this number is important because effectively Japan is a producer of machines to produce whatever else for the world. One of the main one. I'm not saying this is the only, but it's one of the main one. And so that's why it's important, because it shows demand for Japanese industrial equipment, basically. And then if we look at Italy, again, we see the similar picture where inflation kind of remains fairly stubborn overall. Now and then actually in China, CPI is going into deflation, as you can see here, and we may see more of that later. However, if you look at the German situation, also inflation fairly stubborn there as well. Again, this is all going back to the economic and energy policy in Europe in general and in Germany in particular. Because effectively what happened to Germany in terms of its energy supply, it's actually importing a lot of electricity and energy from France, which kept its nuclear power stations, for a foreseeable future, and I think they supply roughly like 50% of electricity needs, or power needs in France, and so that's what sort of allows Germany to sort of stay sort of afloat, but in very bad situation, in very bad position, and I would say, and there is no sign inside Germany that there will be reversal of this policy. So that really means that situation in Germany probably going to get worse before it's going to get any better. Okay, let's kind of go closer to Ukraine. So first I want to provide update on Russian economic situation, which is deteriorating. I mentioned this before, even though technically Russia posted very nice GDP growth print. I think it was like 4.7% quarter on quarter. But the FX market really paints a totally different picture, where a Russian ruble dropped to $100 per ruble. If you follow this, I think probably 2-3 weeks ago we were talking about like 94, 95. So as you can see, the uh, the decline in Russian currency is accelerating. This might be sort of stopped for some time. I think $100 is where Russian government will try to sort of the line that they will try to defend, because eventually it may create a panic inside of Russia, because every citizen understands that they are losing their savings, that they basically being robbed by this decline in the Russian currency, and so it may create sort of like a panic where people will be switching in large numbers to whatever other foreign currency they can get in Russia. Related to this, actually, there is the prices for like grain, flour starting to go up as well, which is again shows how this whole inflation situation is. In some ways, it's counterintuitive because Russia has a huge bumper crop of wheat, basically all kind of grains. So there's definitely no shortages, at least from the last year. But the prices are going up. It's just a sign of the overall economic situation and inflationary spiral that's sort of developing in Russia, and that may create huge first economic problems and then social problems in Russia. Now I'm gonna switch finally to Ukraine, to the battlefield in Ukraine, and I'm gonna do a walkthrough in a clockwise fashion, as I always do. Situation along the state border remains more or less the same, meaning there's regular exchange of all sort of adversarial sort of actions, but nothing sort of extraordinary, nothing out of ordinary. Now let's move to the North Luhansk front line. Things here are the same. Russian forces are putting pressure here where I'm showing towards Kislivka and then a little bit north of Kupiansk. This is not some kind of like major offensive. It's not collapse of Ukrainian front the way it's being portrayed in the Russian propaganda outlets. It just Russian command is putting strong pressure, tactical pressure on the Ukrainian side, so Ukrainian forces pool reserves that they could use in the south, in Zaporizhya and along Npro River, so that they are basically trying to stop that offensive by putting pressure here, and that's essentially all it is. Yes, there were announcements that Ukrainian administration is evacuating this villages in this area where I'm showing, but I would say that's actually proper move, and it should always being done, and that's not really a sign of some kind of collapse or impending collapse of the front line. There is a strong tactical pressure, and so far Ukrainian forces are holding, despite initially, as I said, there was loss of this tiny village here in Novoserivsky, which is basically next to this village Kuzemivka, but there's no true meaningful sort of advance or success on the Russian side here. Now let's switch to the North Donbass front line. Northern sector is pretty much dead. It doesn't mean that it's truly quiet, but it's just skirmishes and really not much going on here. In the southern sector, the fighting really is happening around this village Klishivka, which looks like it's basically part of it the Ukrainian, part of it is either no man's land or Russian. So the situation there is, call it unclear, meaning that, as I said before, it's kind of like work in progress where Ukrainian troops are trying to liberate this village, but it's definitely not going easy, well, and so on. And it may take some time before that really happens. Now let's move to the central Donbass front line, and things here are sort of standard as they always are here since the beginning of the war, essentially. which is this is probably the most, I would say, stable section of the front line in the entire war. So again, attacks here north of Avdiivka, near Marinka, with zero success for the Russian side. Now let's move to the Zaporizhya front line. Things here are sort of this, I would say, suicidal quasi-offensive is continuing. Ukrainian troops actually managed to squeeze Russian troops a little bit, and apparently they managed to gain ground in Robotino. Doesn't mean that they control the entire village, but apparently the fighting is going on the northern outskirts of the village. So basically, slowly but surely, Ukrainian troops are squeezing Russian side, but it's the cost in terms of human lives is way too high, and Ukraine cannot pay that price. So essentially, in order to liberate everything, Ukraine doesn't have people to do that, to liberate at this this cost, this every village. And the reason I'm saying that, because it's not true offensive. There is no really decisive breakthrough. It just squeeze, and that's really road to nowhere in the long run for Ukraine. There's continuing fighting here for the Zaporizhya. As I said before, Ukrainian forces managed to gain control of the portion of the village, but then apparently they are basically right on where squeezed right to outskirts of the village. So, but again, the same situation is here, that it's going to be slow squeeze, and eventually, yes, Ukrainian forces will squeeze Russian forces out, but the price that's going to be paid for this is definitely not worth it. And that's a whole problem with this so-called offensive, which, as I said before, is not really offensive. It's just suicidal squeeze of Russian troops. That's strategically, it's a road to nowhere for Ukraine. Now let's move to the situation along the Npro River, and here situation is actually there was sort of this tactical success, and Ukrainian forces managed to keep this bridgehead on the eastern side of Dnipro River near the village Kazachyi Lageri. And so actually this is actually the quite big positive development. Even the bridgehead is obviously tiny, but this bridgehead, the significance of it is unlike the other bridgeheads where you essentially have like just one road to get out of those bridgeheads, which is going to be suicidal to break out from those bridgeheads. In this situation, you have sort of a normal situation where you can break out in many directions. You're not blocked by the marshes and so on. So this is definitely a much better bridgehead, and opens up down the road opportunities for Ukrainian forces to make a decisive move in this area. So and obviously overcome the problems what's going on on the Zaporizhya front line. So this is encouraging development, but doesn't mean sort of that the exploitation of this bridgehead is going to be imminent. So far, it's still tiny, and essentially, it's a question about sort of more survival at this point than exploiting it. But as I said, Russian troops, apparently this 7th Airborne Division was pulled to the Zaporizhya front line, and so that's one of the main reasons why this attack was successful, because the Russian defensive lines are becoming thinner, and as you can see, it's a long sort of front line where you need to keep troops, and the Russian forces need them on the Zaporizhia front line. And overall, it's becoming very clear that Russian forces are becoming thinner in terms of manpower due to attrition. In another round of mobilization is coming in Russia, probably sometime in the fall. Could be September, could be October, but it's definitely coming because by that time it's going to be even more obvious that Russian forces in Ukraine need more soldiers to keep what they captured so far, or they will be sort of disorderly collapse, similar to what happened in Izum last year, near Izum, Balaklia last year, and what happened with Kherson bridgehead that Russian forces controlled on the western side of Npro River. So basically, this is going to be dilemma for the Russian military top or political top, I would say, what to do, because probably by that mid-fall, idea of another round of mobilization is going to be quite unpopular, given that economic deterioration in Russia, and as I mentioned, because of the situation with the currency, which creates inflation. It's effectively it's decrease in living standards in Russia that's happening and affects everyone. So we'll see what happens. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Until next time.